$20, a rusted Sharps rifle, and a half-blind pack mule. That's what a sister's life was worth in the bitter autumn of '81. When Hiram shoved the coins into his coat, Cora didn't scream. She just watched the mountain man who bought her, waiting for the nightmare to begin. The Red Dog Saloon smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and the sour tang of men who had spent too long losing at cards. Dust motes drifted lazily through the shafts of pale afternoon light, piercing the grimy windows. Cora sat rigidly on a splintered wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap. Her knuckles were bone white. Beside her, Hiram was sweating, despite the chill draft blowing in from the floorboards. He kept wiping his palms on his denim trousers, a rhythmic, frantic motion that made Cora sick to her stomach. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at her brother's weak, twitching jaw, she knew she would spit in his face, and that wouldn't change a damn thing. The deed was already done. No, the debt was already called in. The man sitting across the scarred oak table didn't look like a savior, nor did he look like a devil. He looked like the mountain itself had sloughed off a piece of its timberline and shaped it into a human. His name was Boone. Just Boone. He wore a coat of thick, poorly cured buffalo hide that smelled of pine pitch, wood smoke, and old blood. His beard was a dark, tangled thicket, and beneath the brim of a battered felt hat, his eyes were the color of hammered lead. They lacked the predatory gleam Cora had come to expect from the men in town. They were just flat, dead. "She's strong," Hiram said, his voice cracking. The silence at the table had stretched too long, and Hiram abhorred silence. "She can cook, mend. She ain't sickly. Barely eats, truth be told." Boone didn't blink. He slowly reached into his heavy coat, the leather creaking, and pulled out a small canvas pouch. He dropped it onto the table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Coins clinked together, a muffled, final sound. Next to it, he placed the heavy iron key to a mule tethered out back. Hiram's hands lunged for the pouch like starved rats. "Pleasure doing business," he stammered, his eyes darting everywhere but at his sister. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Cora, you be good now. You hear? It's for the best. The bank was going to take the farm anyway." Cora didn't answer. She tasted copper. She had bitten the inside of her cheek so hard it was bleeding. She swallowed the blood. It tasted like betrayal. Hiram didn't wait for a response. He bolted for the door, pushing past a pair of drunken miners, eager to put distance between himself and the transaction. Boone sat still for a long moment. The saloon around them continued its low murmur, the patrons deliberately ignoring the sale of a human being in their midst. In the territory, a debt was a debt. Finally, Boone stood. He towered over the table. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. "Get your things," he grunted. His voice was like grinding stones, rough from disuse. "I have what I'm wearing," Cora said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her. Inside, her chest was a hollow, echoing cavern, but her voice was cold iron. She wore a faded blue cotton dress, a frayed wool shawl, and scuffed leather boots. Boone frowned, a subtle shift in the dense thicket of his beard. He looked at her thin shawl, then glanced toward the window. The sky over the peaks was turning a bruised, ominous purple. Winter was coming early. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the batwing doors. Cora followed. She had nowhere else to go. Stepping outside, the cold hit her like an open-handed slap. The wind, sweeping down off the Bitterroot Range, was carrying the sharp bite of snow. Boone was already untying a massive, ill-tempered roan gelding. Next to it stood the sway-backed mule Hiram had traded her for, loaded down with sacks of flour, salt, and coffee. Boone unhooked a heavy wool blanket from his saddle horn and threw it at her. It hit her in the chest, smelling strongly of horse sweat and dust. "Wrap up," he said, not looking at her. "It's a long ride." He mounted the gelding with surprising grace for a man of his size. Cora stood in the frozen mud of the street, the blanket clutched in her arms. She looked down the road, where the stagecoach route led back east. For a split second, her muscles coiled. Run. But where? She had no money, no food, and the temperature was dropping fast. She would freeze to death before midnight. She threw the blanket over her shoulders, shivering as the coarse wool scratched her neck, and climbed onto the back of the pack mule. There was no saddle, just a rough burlap sack thrown over the animal's spine. They rode out of town without looking back. The transition from the muddy, rutted streets of the settlement to the wild timberline was abrupt. Within an hour, the sounds of hammers and shouting faded, replaced by the eerie, overwhelming silence of the deep woods. The wind howled through the tops of the lodgepole pines, a low, mourning sound. Cora's hands quickly went numb. She gripped the mule's coarse mane, trying to absorb whatever body heat the animal offered. Her mind raced, playing out every horrific scenario she had ever heard whispered among the women in town about the men who lived up in the high country. They were savages, hermits, animals who had forgotten how to walk upright. She expected Boone to stop the horses at any moment, pull her down into the dirt, and claim what he had paid for. But he didn't. He just rode. He didn't look back to check on her. He didn't speak. He simply carved a path through the rising snowdrifts, a dark, silent monolith, leading her further out of the world she knew. The cold seeped past the blanket, past her thin dress, settling deep into her marrow. Her teeth began to chatter, a violent, uncontrollable clicking that sounded loud in the quiet forest. Boone reined his horse in abruptly. Cora's mule bumped into the gelding's rump and stopped. Boone twisted in his saddle, his flat, gray eyes locked onto her shivering form. Cora braced herself, her chin lifting defiantly, despite the trembling of her jaw. If he touched her, she would bite him. She swore to herself she would take a piece of his flesh. Boone reached behind his saddle, unbuckling a heavy oilskin tarp. He tossed it to her. "Over the blanket," he said, turning back around and spurring his horse forward. "Keeps the wind out." Cora caught the heavy material. It was stiff with cold, smelling of linseed oil and old grease. She draped it over herself. It was suffocating, but within minutes, the brutal edge of the wind was blunted. A tiny, pathetic pocket of warmth began to form against her skin. She hated the warmth. She hated that it came from him. She retreated into her own mind, building a fortress of numbness, preparing herself for the destination. They arrived at dusk. The cabin didn't look built so much as it looked like it had grown out of the side of the mountain. It was made of thick, unpeeled logs, the chinking packed with dried mud and moss. The roof was heavy with sod and a fresh layer of snow. It sat in a small clearing, backed up against a sheer rock face, utterly isolated. The nearest neighbor was a 2-day ride down treacherous switchbacks. Boone dismounted, his boots crunching heavily in the snow. He tied the gelding to a post, then walked over to Cora's mule. He didn't offer a hand to help her down. He just began untying the packs. Cora slid off the mule. Her legs were dead wood. The moment her boots hit the frozen ground, her knees buckled. She hit the dirt hard, her hands scraping against a jagged rock. The pain flared, sharp and hot, cutting through the numbness. She gasped, staring at the dark blood welling up on her palm. Boone paused, a sack of flour hoisted onto his shoulder. He looked down at her, then at her bleeding hand. He didn't say, "Are you all right?" He didn't offer pity. He simply turned his head toward the cabin. "Door's open," he said, and walked past her. Cora pushed herself up, ignoring the sting in her palm. She wiped the blood on her faded dress, leaving a dark, rusty streak, and followed him inside. The interior of the cabin was a single room, swallowed by shadows. It smelled of wood ash, cured meat, and the metallic tang of unwashed pelts. Boone struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the harsh reality of her new life. He lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a rusted nail. The yellow light revealed a dirt floor packed hard as stone, a massive stone fireplace taking up one entire wall, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. In the corner sat a bed frame strung with rawhide rope, supporting a mattress stuffed with pine needles and dried grass. It was primitive, bare, a place for survival, not living. Boone dropped the supplies on the table. He took a bucket and walked out the door, returning a few minutes later with it filled with snow. He hung it over the hearth, then began building a fire with practiced economic movements. Birch bark, kindling, a spark from flint and steel, and a steady breath. The fire caught, throwing, dancing, leaping shadows against the log walls. Cora stood frozen by the door, the heavy tarp still wrapped around her shoulders. She felt like an intruder, a captive. She watched him, trying to gauge his mood, trying to predict the violence she was certain was coming. Men didn't pay $20 in a rifle for a woman just to have her stand by the door. Boone stood up, brushing ash from his knees. He turned to her. In the firelight, the scars on his face were visible, a jagged white line cutting through his left eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline. He pointed a massive, calloused finger toward the bed in the corner. "Yours," he said. Cora stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "And where do you sleep?" she asked. Her voice shook, just a fraction, betraying her fear. Boone didn't answer immediately. He walked over to a stack of furs in the opposite corner, picked up 2 thick bear hides, and tossed them onto the dirt floor near the hearth. He kicked them with his boot until they formed a makeshift pallet. "Here," he muttered. He didn't look at her for gratitude. He didn't seem to want anything from her at all. He turned back to the fire, taking a rusted iron skillet down from a peg. He sliced thick, fatty pieces of salt pork and tossed them into the pan. The meat sizzled and popped, filling the cabin with a heavy, greasy aroma. Cora's stomach growled, a violent, humiliating sound in the quiet room. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Boone glanced at her over his shoulder, then grabbed a tin plate. He scooped the meat onto it, added a hard, dry biscuit from a tin on the shelf, and set it on the table. He poured a cup of black coffee from a pot that looked like it had been boiling since summer. He slid the plate and the mug to the opposite side of the table. He didn't invite her to sit. He just took his own plate and sat down, eating mechanically, staring into the flames. Cora approached the table slowly, as if the floorboards were rigged to explode. She sat on the edge of the wooden chair. She picked up the fork. It was slightly bent. She ate. The salt pork was tough and overly salty. The biscuit tasted of dust, and the coffee was bitter enough to curl her toes. It was the best meal she had ever tasted. She ate with a desperate, animal urgency, scraping the tin plate clean. When she finished, she looked up. Boone was watching her. Not with lust, not with malice. Just a quiet, unnerving observation, the way a man might watch a stray dog eating scraps on his porch. He stood up, his plate empty. He walked to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of the bed and rummaged through it. When he turned back, he was holding something wrapped in an oily rag. He walked to the table and dropped it in front of her. It landed with a heavy, metallic clatter. Cora flinched, pulling her hands back. She stared at the rag. "Open it," he said. With trembling fingers, she peeled back the greasy cloth. Resting inside was a hunting knife. The blade was 7 inches long, thick carbon steel, honed to a razor edge. The handle was carved bone, yellowed with age, and stained with use. It was a vicious, practical tool. A killer's tool. Cora looked up at him, her chest heaving. Confusion and terror warred in her throat. "Why are you giving me this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Boone leaned forward, placing his massive hands flat on the table. He smelled of sweat and wood smoke. "Mountain lions," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Wolves, sometimes men." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers, seeing right through the tough facade she was trying so desperately to hold up. "Or me, if you ever feel the need." Cora's breath hitched. She stared at the knife, then back at him. She expected a trick, a twisted game, but his face was utterly devoid of humor. It was a simple statement of fact. He was giving her back a piece of the agency her brother had stolen. Before she could process it, Boone turned away. He walked to the door, grabbed a wooden bucket, and stepped out into the freezing night, pulling the door shut behind him. Left alone in the flickering light, Cora reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the blade. It was heavy, real. She picked it up, feeling the balance of it in her hand. For the first time since Hiram had pushed her into that chair at the Red Dog Saloon, the tight, suffocating band of panic around her chest loosened just a fraction. She wasn't safe. She was trapped in a cabin at the edge of the world with a stranger who looked more beast than man. But as she slid the heavy knife under the thin straw pillow of her bed, Cora realized something profound and terrifying. She wasn't a victim here. Not yet. Winter did not arrive in the high country. It fell like a massive iron lid. By late November, the snowdrift swallowed the lower half of the cabin windows, plunging the single room into a perpetual, dim twilight. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling wind, the scratching of dry branches against the roof sod, and the suffocating proximity of Boone. Cora waited for the monster to show his face. She kept the bone-handled knife tucked in her boot during the day and beneath her mattress at night. She slept with one ear tuned to the rhythm of his breathing on the dirt floor. If it hitched, if the rustle of his heavy bear hides indicated he was rising, her hand would immediately find the cold steel grip. But the monster never materialized. Boone was a machine of routine. He woke before the sun, breathing plumes of white mist into the freezing cabin. He stoked the fire, boiled the bitter coffee, and checked his trap lines. He spoke only in necessities. Wood's low. Snow's too heavy for the roof. Beans need soaking. He never looked at her with hunger. He looked at her the way he looked at the rusted skillet or the worn axe handle as a fact of his environment. At first, his indifference was a relief. By January, it was maddening. The silence in the cabin was so thick, Cora felt she had to push through it just to walk to the hearth. She began to mend his torn shirts just to have something to do, her fingers callousing from the heavy sailcloth needle. When he noticed the clumsy stitches on his cuffs, he didn't thank her. He just left a slightly larger portion of deer meat on her tin plate that evening. The break in their brittle routine came on a Tuesday in late February. The wind had been screaming for 2 days, a whiteout blizzard that made it impossible to see the tree line. Boone had gone out to clear the chimney vent. Cora was sitting by the fire, scraping the grease from a badger pelt, when the heavy oak door smashed open. A wall of white snow and freezing air blasted into the room. Boone staggered in. He didn't close the door. He took 2 stumbling steps and collapsed face first onto the hard-packed dirt. Cora dropped the scraper. Boone? He didn't move. She rushed forward, shoving the door shut against the howling gale, and knelt beside him. The smell of copper and fresh meat hit her before she saw it. A jagged, ragged tear ripped through the thick wool of his trousers, starting at his left thigh and ending near the knee. It wasn't an animal bite. He had slipped on the icy roof and fallen onto the rusted, iron teeth of an old logging crosscut saw, leaning against the cabin wall. Dark, arterial blood was pooling rapidly on the dirt, turning it to black mud. Cora froze. The wind rattled the window panes. She looked at his pale, sweating face, then down at the blood. She could let him die. The thought bloomed in her mind, cold and rational. If he died, he couldn't hurt her. But if he died, she would be utterly alone in a frozen tomb. She didn't know how to hunt in 4 feet of snow. She didn't know how to navigate the switchbacks. Her hand went to her boot. She pulled out the knife he had given her. She didn't use it on his throat. She shoved the blade under the heavy wool of his trousers and sliced upward, ripping the fabric away from the wound. It was deep. Yellow fat and red muscle gaped open, welling with dark blood. "Boone! Wake up," she grunted, rolling his massive dead weight onto his back. He groaned, his eyes rolling blindly under his lids. She ran to the hearth, grabbed a rag and plunged it into the boiling kettle of snow water. It scalded her hands, raising instant red blisters, but she didn't stop. She wrung it out and pressed it fiercely into the gash. Boone roared, a horrific animal sound of pure agony, and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bone-crushing force. "Hold still, damn you!" Cora screamed back, her voice cracking with terror and adrenaline. She didn't flinch away. She leaned her entire body weight onto the scalding rag, pinning his leg to the floor. He passed out again. For the next hour, Cora worked in a frantic, bloody haze. She found his sewing kit, thick sinew thread, and a curved leather needle. She poured half a bottle of cheap, foul-smelling rye whiskey, directly into the open flesh. She vomited into the ash bucket when the smell of raw meat and alcohol hit her throat. Then, she wiped her mouth, sat back down, and began to stitch. Her hands shook. The needle was dull, and his skin was thick as hide. She pushed the steel through, her own blood from her blistered hands mixing with his. It was butcher's work, uneven, ugly, and brutal. When she tied the final knot, she collapsed back against the stone hearth, her chest heaving, her hands coated in drying, sticky rust. She looked at the mountain man. He was pale, his breath rattling in his chest. He looked fragile. It was the most unsettling thing she had ever seen. The fever took him that night. For 3 days, Boone burned. He thrashed blindly on his pallet, muttering in a dialect Cora didn't understand, wrestling with ghosts she couldn't see. She didn't sleep. She sat cross-legged on the dirt floor beside him, forcing snow water between his cracked lips, changing the foul-smelling dressings, and adding wood to the fire. In his delirium, the impenetrable wall he had built around himself crumbled. He wasn't a silent monolith anymore. He was a terrified boy, crying out for someone named Sarah. He was a broken man apologizing to an empty room. He had bought her to be a worker, maybe a distraction. But looking at his scarred, sweating face, Cora realized the truth. He had bought her because he was slowly going mad from the isolation. He had forgotten how to be human, and he was terrified of slipping completely into the dark. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. The silence in the cabin was no longer oppressive. It felt exhausted. Empty. Cora was dozing in the wooden chair when she heard the rustle of furs. Her eyes snapped open. Boone was awake. His gray eyes were clear, sunken deep into his skull, rimmed with dark, bruised circles. He looked down at his leg. He saw the clumsy, thick stitches, the clean rags, the bucket of bloody water pushed to the corner. Then, he looked at her. He saw her blistered, stained hands. He saw the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of her face. He didn't say thank you. The words wouldn't have fit in his mouth. Instead, he slowly pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing as the skin of his leg pulled tight. "You ruined my good trousers," he rasped. His voice was weaker than a dry leaf. Cora stared at him. A bubble of hysteria rose in her chest. She clamped her jaw shut, fighting it down, but a single, ragged bark of a laugh escaped her lips. "They smelled like bear grease and rot anyway," she shot back, her voice hoarse. The corner of Boone's mouth twitched. It was a microscopic movement, almost imperceptible beneath the tangled beard. But it was there. A smile. "Water," he grunted. Cora filled a tin cup and brought it to him. She didn't set it on the floor. She handed it to him. Their fingers brushed. His skin was dry and fever-hot. Hers was calloused and cold. He met her gaze over the rim of the cup, and for the first time, he really saw her. He didn't see the $20 he gave her brother. He saw the woman who had dragged him back from the edge of the abyss. The thaw came a month later. The icicles clinging to the eaves began to weep, a steady, rhythmic dripping that sounded like a ticking clock. Boone's leg healed with a thick, ugly purple scar. He walked with a heavy limp, favoring his right side, but he walked. One evening, as the sky turned a soft, bruised lilac, Boone sat by the fire, whittling a piece of soft pine. Cora was sitting at the table, shelling dried beans. The tension between them had changed. It wasn't the sharp, dangerous wire of captivity anymore. It was the heavy, unspoken weight of a debt that couldn't be repaid with coins or labor. "Stage route opens in 2 weeks, Boone said quietly, not looking up from his knife. Wood shavings curled onto the dirt floor. "Snow's low enough in the pass. Gelding can make it." Cora stopped shelling. The beans rattled in the tin bowl. "You sending me back to Hiram?" Boone stopped carving. He slowly put the knife down. "I ain't sending you anywhere. You're a free woman. You saved my life. Debt's clear." He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his flat gray eyes. "I got silver under the floorboards. Enough for a ticket to San Francisco. Or back east. Wherever you want." Cora looked around the cramped, dark-smelling cabin. She looked at the rough-hewn logs, the smoke-stained ceiling, and then at the giant, scarred man sitting by the hearth. The world out there had sold her for $20. The world out there was full of men like her brother, weak and eager to trade her away. In this cabin, the rules were brutal, but they were honest. Here, she held a knife. Here, she had bled and sweated and fought death and won. "I don't know anyone in San Francisco," Cora said, her voice steady. Boone finally looked at her. His eyes searched her face, looking for the lie, looking for the trap. He found nothing but the same hard, unyielding iron he possessed himself. "Winter's hard up here," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "Summer ain't much better." "I know," Cora said. She picked up another dried pod and snapped it open. The beans fell into the bowl with a sharp Times clack. "I noticed your other shirts are fraying at the collar. Better fix them before the heavy work starts." Boone stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched out, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of melting snow, snapping fire, and the quiet, stubborn resilience of two people who had nothing left in the world but the ground they stood on, and each other. He picked his knife back up. "Use better thread this time," he muttered. Cora didn't smile, but the hollow cavern in her chest finally felt closed. "Don't tear them on saws, and I won't have to." Thank you for listening to the final chapters of this Wild West romance drama. Cora and Boone's story proves that sometimes the hardest places forge the strongest bonds, and that survival isn't just about breathing, it's about choosing who to breathe for. If this gritty tale of redemption and resilience kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive storytelling.